Hello and welcome to Downtime Activities. My name's Matthew and this is the Help Action, our series where we break down 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rules or ideas, kind of get into the nitty-gritty rules of how they work, and give our advice on how we think best to use them. Today we'll be going over Readied Actions in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, how they work, and how you should use them. Alright, let's talk readying an action in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. To begin with, the ready action is an action, meaning it's an action taken inside of combat typically, or at least an initiative. We'll talk later in this video about out of combat or out of initiative readied actions and my thoughts on that, but the ready action is an action you take as your action for your turn. This means that if you do that on your turn, you will still have your bonus action and your move to use as normal. To set a readied action, you have to decide a perceivable circumstance that will trigger your action that you've readied to go off. This can be a lot of different things. A simple example is, if the enemy walks up to me, then I will swing my sword at it, etc. Then you will choose the action, so in that case scenario it was swinging the sword, that you will take in response to that specific trigger. Or you can choose to move up to your speed in response to it. When that trigger occurs, you can either take your reaction right after that trigger happens, or ignore the trigger and not take that action. It is worth noting here that you use your reaction to actually take the action that you've readied, meaning you will no longer have your reaction. So if you ready an action to cast a spell at an enemy, and you do that when the trigger happens, you can't then use your reaction to counterspell a later threatening spell coming at you. You only get one reaction around, and you've used it for your readied action. Another note, if you ready an attack action, and you have extra attack, you will only get to make a single attack, no matter how many extra attacks you have from that feature. This is because extra attack specifically says that it can only be applied on your turn. If you take the attack action on your turn, you get those benefits. So you do not get them on a readied attack action. Spells work a little differently. Spells will follow a lot of the same rules. However, when you ready a spell, you will be casting it as normal on your turn, but holding its energy and then releasing it whenever that trigger happens. This means that whether or not you actually use that reaction, the spell slot will be spent, the spell will be cast, it's just whether or not you choose to release that energy. This is very important if you're playing a spellcaster to be very mindful of. The spell also has to have a casting time of one action. You can't ready a bonus action spell, you can't ready a reaction spell, not that you'd need to, but it has to have a casting time of a single action. And lastly, holding on to that spell's magic will require you to maintain concentration. This means that if before your trigger happens, you take damage and you fail your save and you lose concentration, then the spell dissipates without its effect going off and your spell slot is wasted. And that's the rules as written, functionally how readying action works. Let's talk out of combat now, because I think this is where it gets a little bit muddier for people, and people want to know if they can ready an action when they're not in initiative yet, and kind of have an attack or an action readied up for a spell they want to cast to kind of get it off for free before a combat starts. And rules as written, the answer is kind of just a flat no. You can't do this. Readied actions are an action you take, meaning you have to be in initiative to ready an action. Now, readying an action is technically something, like I said, rules is written, that you can't do out of combat. I would sometimes allow players to ready an action outside of combat, but it would have to be some pretty niche circumstances, and honestly, I would kind of shy away from doing this in a lot of circumstances. Oftentimes, this readied action idea is something that a player is doing to try and, as I said before, get a free action before a combat starts. And this sort of thing is usually best left to surprise. It'll fill that role very well. Most actions that the players would want to ready would only really be able to be readied if the players are acting before their enemy realizes it. Things like a readied sneak attack from the rogue when a guard moves past them while they are sneaking. I'm not going to go over surprise in detail here, But if you're interested, there's a previous help action diving deep on this exact subject, and it's where I would leave this kind of pre-combat stuff to, because it just runs a lot smoother and avoids kind of overuse or misuse of readying abilities. That being said, in some social situations, if the players are potentially feeling like a character might pull a weapon on them, there's some kinds of options for readying an action, but honestly, even in situations like that, surprise is going to make the most sense. And if the players aren't surprised, they're going to get to act that first round anyways, and the rules are kind of written this way for a very specific reason, and I would stick to that 9 times out of 10. Now that we have the rules kind of down and discussed here, I want to go over my advice with how best to use these rules. And to start with, I'm going to give some advice to players readying actions out there. As a player, use your readied actions whenever it makes sense, but be mindful about the rules. If you are a spellcaster and you're hoping to have a spell go off at just the right moment, readying it is a really great idea. However, if you are not really confident that your trigger will go off, then do not ready that spell, because you will lose the slot. Similarly, as a martial class, readying an attack for just the right moment can really help in a combat. However, if you have extra attack and you could instead make 2 or even more attacks against an enemy, that'll often do a lot more good than a well-timed single attack. So be mindful about those limitations, those limiting factors with readied actions. And as a DM, remember that enemies can ready actions too, and this can be used in interesting ways to make more dynamic combats. Things like a lower power lackey readying his action to use the help action to give a bigger hitting enemy advantage right before they make their attack on their turn can be a really fun and dynamic twist to turn into a combat. It's one less attack the party's taken, but that big hitting enemy is going to have advantage and therefore be more likely to hit and more likely to crit. Also, as a DM, be fairly lenient on what triggers the players choose to use with their readied actions. However, make sure that your players are pretty specific in what triggers they give. By this, I mean that it can be a pretty wide swath of things that could trigger these sorts of actions to go off, so don't be too particular in what sorts of things they can pick. Just make sure that what they pick, they're specific and thorough in describing, so that no confusion is out there and nobody's taking advantage of the system. Also, avoid intentionally not taking an action that a readied spell has set as its trigger. This can cause a lot of hurt feelings. If the player is really careless in what their trigger is, then by all means, punish that. You don't have to go out of your way to, but if there's no real reasonable circumstance where that trigger would go off, then that's on that player and they lose their spell slot. But if they have a pretty reasonable trigger for their spell, don't go out of your way to not have your enemies do that particular action, just so that they waste their spell slot. This will end with a very frustrated player and probably some animosity between you and them. And that has been our help action on Readied Actions in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Hope you found this useful, hope you learned something, and can kind of go forth from here knowing how best to use the Readied Action both as a player and a DM. If you found this useful, please check out the rest of our content. We have a ton of help actions on all sorts of different rules, how to use them, our advice on them, that kind of stuff. Everything from the help action to things more niche like how to play a vampire or a werewolf. We also have gameplay on the channel, an Epic 6 D&D game that's live and playing right now. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.